So the Yankees position player groups are, definitely not the strongest that it'll be this offseason. I think it clearly will get better with acquisitions that the Yankees should make. But as of right now, these are the position players we have pre-lockout, and so I would like to do a positional review of these player groups. Now, I'm going to be doing guys who are going to be on the Major League roster. So I will not be discussing prospects or minor league deals for guys who are really not projected to be on the Major League roster on opening day. So, for example, today we'll be talking about Sanchez and Higashioka particularly. Yes, I'll briefly mention guys like Rob Brantley, David Freitas, and potentially, Josh Bro as well. Guys who maybe will get some Major League at-bats, though shouldn't get a ton of at-bats, and so won't play a huge factor in the Yankees' catching depth this season. With that being said, though, I'm Ryan Garcia from Fireside Yankees. You guys know where to find me at Ryan Garcia ESN. You know to find the Fireside Yankees Twitter at Fireside Yankees. And of course, you know to check out Empire Sports Media for all your New York sports content. With that being said, let's talk about the Yankees catchers.
That one's in deep to left field.
And Schultz cashes in.
Got him. Oh, what a play.
Stanton forward again.
Here comes Wade. Here's the throw. He's safe.
Cannon.
Gary Sanchez is projected to be a rather pedestrian player in 2022. With a 307 on base percentage, a 434 slugging percentage, a 101 WRC plus, and in 392 projected plate appearances, accumulating 20 home runs and a 1.4 F4, on the surface, this may not seem like such a bad thing until you look at the defensive metrics. Now, Steamer does not project anything beyond just Fangraphs adjusted defense, and so, we're going to have to use past defensive production, which, again, could change if something drastic happens with how Gary Sanchez receives pitches, or, how Tanner Swanson works with Gary over the offseason, but that's an assumption you really can't make because you can make that assumption for nearly any player on an organization, and it's an unfair assumption to make that a player will just decide to get better to prove a point. Rather, a player should be expected to, kind of hit where they were at defensively before. And for catchers, unless there's a drastic change, that doesn't really change. Offense is a lot more different when you're talking about offense, and it's why I use projections, because oftentimes players don't perform at their true talent level in a given season, and then over a larger sample size, it evens itself out. Now, Gary Sanchez is a very volatile player. I'll definitely give the benefit of the doubt to both sides of the Gary Sanchez debate. There is definitely a case that Gary Sanchez could go out and put a 70 to 80 WRC plus and bad defense and be one of the worst catchers in baseball. However, there is also a chance Gary Sanchez goes out and puts out a 120 to 125 WRC plus, and his defense doesn't end up being the worst in the world, and he is a pretty good catcher. That being said, though, with most things, the answer falls in the middle, and the floor for Gary Sanchez is much worse than the ceiling for Gary Sanchez, and a lot of that is due to his defensive limitations. I've mentioned briefly about his defensive issues, and it's really stemming from his inability to frame. According to fielding runs above average, called strikes above average, frame rating on Fangraphs, and Baseball Savant's framing metrics, Gary Sanchez is a well below average framer, and that's the crux of defensive value for catchers. It's hard for you to provide much value to your team as a catcher if you're so bad defensively, unless you're, of course, going out and being one of the best offensive players in baseball, not just one of the best offensive catchers in baseball, because that's, again, a rather low bar. Gary Sanchez, again, doesn't provide that offensive value that justifies him being good enough to, be a surefire lock to start in 2022. I really think the Yankees should have upgraded their catching position, their catching depth, whether it had been Jacob Stallings or Manny Pena, or platooning Higashioka with Tucker Barnhart. Those would have been much better options than simply starting Gary Sanchez, who's a deeply flawed player. Not because he strikes out a lot, not because he's trying to hit home runs, but because he's a bad defender. If Gary Sanchez was a good defender, Gary Sanchez would be extended by now. That's just the reality of it, because a 100 WRC plus catcher with good defense is a very, very, very good baseball player, whereas a 100 WRC plus catcher with bad defense is probably not the best option to be trotting out at catcher on opening day. Now, does that mean that Gary Sanchez is 100% doomed? Absolutely not. We have seen guys make progress over an offseason, but to expect that Gary Sanchez takes a sudden leap in performance when he is at the age of 28, when he has regressed heavily from his 2016 and 2017 seasons, is just unrealistic. Now, yes, his 2019 was a solid season offensively, but it really wasn't that good of a season. With him being right around a 3 WAR per 650 player and most catchers not getting to 650 plate appearances, it means that Gary Sanchez's ceiling is severely limited and that he's really never going to be a 4-win player ever again. I hope he turns it around because Gary Sanchez is probably going to be on the roster, and when you're getting paid $7.5 million, I'd rather you be productive than unproductive, but I just don't see that in the cards for Gary Sanchez. With that being said, though, let's talk about his battery mate, Higashioka. Now, Higashioka is widely considered the Yankees' backup catcher, and I do think on the depth chart he will be the Yankees' backup catcher, but I think he's the most deserving option as the starting catcher. If you look at his projections for next year, you see a 278 on base percentage, a 419 slugging percentage, an 88 WRC+, and in 223 plate appearances, 10 home runs, and a 1.2 F-WAR. Now, on the surface, that's okay. I mean, how much different can it be than Gary Sanchez? The F-WARs are similar. Actually, Gary Sanchez is projected to have more F-WAR, you may say, and he's projected to be the better offensive player, so why should I think Higashioka should start over Sanchez? And that's because if you look at the plate appearances, if you extrapolate the plate appearances for Higashioka, which means you give Higashioka and Gary Sanchez the same amount of plate appearances, Higashioka's F-WAR, or Fangraphs WAR, is projected to be more valuable. On a per-rate basis, Higashioka is a more valuable player than Gary Sanchez is. And that is because he's one of the best defensive players behind the dish in baseball. In fielding runs above average, in called strikes above average, catching defensive adjustment, Fangraphs frame rating, and StatCast frame rating, Higashioka is one of the premier defensive players, behind the dish, and he's one of the best game callers you can have behind the plate as well. He doesn't have the freakish arm talent of Gary Sanchez, but again, it doesn't really seem to affect either because both guys get stolen upon at a similar rate and give up similar amount of stolen bases on a per rate basis. And so, again, not too concerned about that. As for Higashioka's offense, yes, he was bad last year offensively, but there were signs at the plate that showed he is a pretty talented hitter. He barrels quite a ton of baseballs with his barrel rate being higher than Gary Sanchez's was, and also sporting a high exit velocity and fly ball rate. Now, Higashioka needs to work on how he, how his fly ball spreads look, and I do think ultimately that given a full season to start, I think Higashioka figures it out at the plate. If the Yankees don't want to start Higashioka flat out, they could find some sort of left-handed option to platoon with him, but I think at this point, Higashioka is the better player between him and Gary Sanchez. Now, yes, Higashioka has a lower offensive ceiling, but again, offense isn't the only thing that matters for catchers, since catching defense is so much more important than in other positions. I don't want to make it seem like I'm telling you that Higashioka is a lock to be very good next year, or that Higashioka is particularly very good. That being said, though, Higashioka is pretty good and is better than Gary Sanchez on a per rate base and on a projected basis at this point. So, Higashioka really strikes me as a guy with a higher ceiling than most people anticipate that he could have, and a guy who really has a lot of potential because of his defensive prowess. Now, he's older, so, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he's going to become the long-time fixture at catcher for the Yankees, but seeing that Sanchez is on a one-year deal because his contract will expire after this season, if you want to go with a short-term option, I think Higashioka is the answer, and I think moving Sanchez to a place where he can, clear things up, get a fresh start, and start somewhere new would be best for both the Yankees and Sanchez, because the Yankees will probably get more production out of their catching tandem and probably end up with a happier Sanchez, since Sanchez is going to get a fresh start somewhere, because I really don't think, I really think he could use one, and I do think that, Sanchez needs a place where he's not scared that he's going to lose his job by April. So, with that being said, though, let's talk about how projections think the Yankees tandem will do in comparison to other tandems, and what tweaks I would make to the Yankees catching tandem to make it better for 2022. So the Yankees are projected to have a 2.8 catching F-WAR, which is 17th in all of baseball in terms of projections. Now, does that mean that Gary Sanchez is the 17th best catcher in baseball? No, because if you look at the 1, 2, and 3, it's the Dodgers, Blue Jays, Phillies, and White Sox. And Yasmani Grandal of the Chicago White Sox is the best catcher in baseball, and he is only on the team with the 4th highest F4. That's because his backup, Zach Collins, is very good. And the Phillies seem to have some better catching depth. The Blue Jays have a lot better catching depth. They have 3 or 4 guys you could throw in that are above average catchers. And the Dodgers have some pretty good catching depth as well. So it's a little bit different there. I would even say, the Cubs probably have a better starting catcher than Gary Sanchez with Wilson Contreras, but that's marginal. I'd say Kevin Plawecki's a better starting catcher than Gary Sanchez is. Again, but the Red Sox project to have a worse catching situation than the Yankees. I'd say Keibert Ruiz is better than Gary Sanchez. Nationals aren't projected to do too well catching-wise. And that's just a matter of depth. Same with Omar Narvaez. It's just a matter of teams not having the depth at catcher or the backup necessary to carry themselves into, being one of the better teams in baseball catching-wise. Now, the Yankees are pretty decent depth-wise. They're a pretty average catching team. However, they could do so much better, and, a lot of it starts with addition via subtraction. And there are methods for the Yankees to get better. There are left-handed catchers that are projected to be pretty decent in 2022. The Yankees could pick up and platoon with Higashioka. Guys like Austin Allen of the Oakland Athletics. Guys like Ben Rodover, something like that. I cannot pronounce his last name. Of the Minnesota Twins. Jason Castro of the Houston Astros. Reese McGuire of the Toronto Blue Jays. I mean, there are guys out there, certainly. And while most people will mention Wilson Contreras, I'm not a big fan of that because I don't think the upgrade is necessarily large enough from Gary Sanchez to justify such a thing. And I guess the other option that I've talked about before is Mitch Garver, though I don't anticipate the Twins moving him right now. That being said, though, the Yankees' best way to get better is by getting rid of Gary Sanchez, not by cutting him per se, because if they were going to do it, they would have just non-tendered him, but by trading him. He could use a fresh start, and the Yankees are kind of getting dragged down by having to start the worst of their 2 right-handed catchers, and that is going to hurt them in the long run. Ultimately, the Yankees could try to trot out Gary and Higashioka and hope that those 2 can work out together, but ultimately, I don't think that ends up working out very well. And you can come back to this and, tell me I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, because the Yankees having a very good Gary Sanchez is very good for the Yankees, and therefore very good for me. I don't see it happening. And that's the big thing. Yes, the potential is there. Yes, you may like Gary Sanchez, but, the most likely outcome is that he isn't very good in 2022. And when we're dealing with very likely outcomes with projections, again, projections are, they aren't going to be perfect, and you shouldn't hold any metric to this standard of perfection, but they are more accurate than just looking at past data. And even if you do look at past data, Higashioka on a per rate basis has cleared Gary Sanchez at this point. So, ultimately, I would say the Yankees looking for any type of left-handed catching they can find and trying to make Higashioka the guy that they have as their main right-handed catcher is going to be the best move for the Yankees, and ultimately is going to be the best move for Gary Sanchez as well, so he can go out and potentially go play somewhere where he can get a lot more playing time. With that being said, though, that'll wrap up today's video. Let me know what you guys think about the Yankees catching tandem. Do you guys agree with the projections for the catching tandem? Do you guys think they're going to be better? Do you think they're going to be worse? Do you think the Yankees have any viable catching options on the roster right now? Do you guys have any players I haven't mentioned that you guys would like the Yankees to acquire? Let me know what you guys think, and I hope to continue this series next week with the next position group we're doing, and have another video come out this week as well. With that being said, though, I'm Ryan Garcia from Fireside Yankees. You know where to find me on Twitter at RyanGarciaESM, and you guys know to subscribe and like this video. Comment, because, sharing opinions is fun, and I love you guys very dearly. I appreciate all of your support. I couldn't be more grateful for all of it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Ryan out.